Before we begin our journey on this peaceful night, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always delightful to discover where our listeners rest their heads as they travel with us through these old memories. The urine bath. I recall a small village, nestled between damp hills and fields that smelled of freshly cut hay, where the wind carried the murmur of streams and the creak of watermills. It was a humble place, with stone houses topped by thatch roofs and doors always open to curious neighbours. There, amid tales of scant harvests and winters that seemed endless, were customs born of sheer necessity, and one of them bore such a pungent odour that even after all these years, I can still sense it in my memories. In those days, soap was a luxury reserved for the Lord's linens and holy days. For us simple folk, only inventive, if disagreeable, solutions remained, yet they were effective. Thus were born the great barrels, dark, massive vessels, often hidden in the shadowed corners of alleyways. Into them, the washerwomen poured urine collected throughout the week, left to ferment until it acquired a smell even dogs avoided, and yet nobody questioned it. "It works better than any perfume on the market," they would say through muffled laughs. One morning, I remember seeing Marta, the village's elderly washerwoman, her hands calloused and apron splattered, bent over one of those barrels. There was something almost solemn in her movements, as if this were less a chore and more a ritual of survival. Around her, children laughed, pinching their noses, while the elders only shook their heads in resigned acceptance. Deep down, everyone knew that, foul as it might be, that odour carried a strange comfort, proof that even in poverty, one could still live with dignity. There were days when the entire village seemed immersed in that acrid aroma. The mischievous wind would carry the scent from the barrels into the central square, causing even the priests, as they exited Mass, to wrinkle their noses discreetly before resuming their prayers. Yet nobody dared to criticize openly. After all, they knew that without this method, clothes would turn as grimy as wet earth and feet would crack until they bled. Between one or two grumbles, life went on, and even the grotesque found its place in the winter routines. Once I saw a newly arrived merchant, boots polished, fine wool cloak, stride past one of those barrels and recoil in horror. Marta only smiled wryly and said, "Give me a week, stranger, and you won't even notice the smell." And she was right. Live here for a few days, and you would understand that among the hay, the stale bread, and the laughter in the taverns, even the stench of fermented urine became part of that strange harmony composed by necessity. Over time, I learned to see beauty where I had once perceived only revulsion. On frosty mornings, when hoarfrost dusted the roofs like a delicate layer of salt, I watched Marta submerge the laundry with the patience of someone reciting the rosary. The steam rising, mingled with the cold, formed a curious mist, almost enchanted, wrapping the washerwomen as if they were figures in an ancient stained glass window. And in the midst of that scene, laughter echoed. Yes, laughter. Because even within that pungent haze, life never lost its ability to mock itself. I remember one afternoon in particular, when a young apprentice trying to help slipped and nearly fell headfirst into a barrel. The guffaws that followed were so loud, even the chapel bells seemed to toll in response. Marta merely gave him a light tap on the neck and said, "Well, at least now you'll come out cleaner than you went in." Though such was life in the village, everything became a story, and every story, however unpleasant, ended with a hearty laugh and a mug of lukewarm ale at the tavern. Some even believed those barrels held more than a mere cleansing method. They healed cracked feet and even ward off evil spirits, claimed old Thomas, a leather worker whose hands were perpetually stained with lime. He swore that after a good ankle-deep soak, he slept without pain, like a well-fed babe. Nobody knew if it was true or just tavern gossip, but on nights of biting cold, many succumbed to the experiment, and, curiously, almost always returned with resigned smiles. As the years passed, this practice ceased to be simple necessity and became almost a symbol of resistance. No perfume could mask the odor, yet in a way no one cared. It served as a reminder that however meager life might be, ingenuity, stubbornness, and a touch of humor could tame misery. And perhaps it was precisely that strange blend of dignity and absurdity that kept us united, as if each barrel were at once a jest and a promise of survival. One night, when the moon was a thin blade hung in the sky, I sat near Marta's barrel just to watch her at work. The cold was so severe, the air itself seemed to crack at the slightest breath, but she seemed unfazed. With slow, deliberate motions, she wrung each garment dry, murmuring old songs her mother had taught her. The sound was low, almost a whisper, as though she sang only for the stone walls around her. And somehow, that melody made everything more bearable, even the smell. When she finished, Marta turned to me and smiled, offering a wooden stool. "Sit down, lad. It's not the aroma you should fear, but the poverty that gave rise to it," she said, with the serenity of one who has seen many winters pass. There we sat, side by side, breathing that acrid air and laughing at our own misfortune. For deep down, we understood. In that village, learning to laugh was as vital as learning to survive. Over time, I came to regard those barrels as something almost familiar. Not merely an object, but a silent gathering point for the village. There, stories were exchanged, secrets whispered, and advice offered with the same naturalness one rinses a worn cloth. Marta, with her steady hands and soft voice, was often confidant to those with nowhere else to turn. As she twisted shirts and wrung out skirts, she listened to confessions and replied only with a gentle nod, as if each strand of washed wool carried away a bit of sorrow. There was a certain solace in it all, something that could not be explained, only felt. When the scent of fermented urine mingled with the distant aroma of bread baking in the hearths, the village felt whole. It was proof that we survived not only on food and shelter, but also on small routines, even the strangest, that reminded us life persisted, stubborn and silent, in the most unlikely places. One frosty morning, I witnessed something I never forgot. A group of travelers from distant lands arrived seeking shelter. Passing Marta's barrels, they turned up their noses and mocked our odd perfume. Yet when night fell and the cold bit through their cloaks, there they were, begging to plunge their cracked feet into that abhorrent liquid. And when they emerged, wrapped in dry socks and timid smiles, no one dared laugh again. In misery, even the grotesque becomes useful. Days later in the tavern, I heard one of the travelers say, "I never thought I'd find relief in a barrel like that." Marta, nearby with her mug of lukewarm ale, only smiled without lifting her eyes. She needed no acknowledgement. She knew that among us, those strange practices were simply further proof that we survived because we knew how to laugh, improvise, and press on, even if we smelled peculiar. Some children, for their part, saw the whole scene as a spectacle. I recall one afternoon when a group of them, hiding behind the barn, wagered who could approach the barrel the closest without pinching their noses. Their laughter rang so loud that even Marta, feigning anger, had to wipe tears of mirth from her eyes. "If only joy were as contagious as this smell," she said, and for a moment we all forgot the hardships of life. Even on the greyest days, when the wind cut like blades and hunger lurked in the stone cottages, those little episodes reminded us there was no shame in surviving however we could. And so, among foul-smelling barrels, pitchers of icy water, and fabrics wrung out by calloused hands, the village found an odd kind of peace. After all, what bound us together was the certainty that even the most unpleasant habit could carry a strand of humanity. There was something almost ceremonial about the days when the whole village gathered for the great wash. Each family brought their worn garments, and while waiting their turn, spoke of harvests, weddings, and even dreams that would never come true. In those moments, the stench ceased to be a nuisance and simply became part of the air we breathed. A minor detail against the sharing of stories and the silent solidarity that kept us warm, even without fire. Marta, as always, was the heart of the gathering. With a simple gesture, she turned that grotesque tableau into something almost homely. "It's not only cloth we cleanse here," she would say, dipping a tunic into the barrel. "Sometimes the soul needs a rinse too." And strange though it might sound, we all believed her. For when we left, smelling of the very village itself, we carried with us a relief that was hard to explain, as if for a brief instant life had become a little more bearable. As years passed, I noticed it wasn't just clothes and cracked feet that found solace in those barrels. Something deeper, almost invisible, was at work. I often saw widows in silence, letting their mourning garments steep in the yellowed liquid, as though hoping the strong odor would carry away some of their grief. And perhaps it did. When they returned home, with their garments clean and their gaze a shade lighter, it seemed the weight of the world had been wrung out along with the fabric. And so, between the acrid vapors and muffled laughter, life went on. No luxury, no promises of a better tomorrow, just that strange certainty that the grotesque could also be a foundation of hope. Each winter, when the barrels were refilled and Marta resumed her work, the whole village inhaled deeply, ready for another season of survival, with humor as acidic as the smell that spread through the streets. I clearly remember one particularly harsh winter when snow blanketed the village for weeks and even the streams froze solid. It was then that the barrels became even more precious. With no running water to wash our feet and almost no soap in sight, everyone turned to Marta, who, with a weary smile, kept the barrels full. Like a silent guardian of a custom only she fully understood. One of those freezing nights, as the wind howled through the window cracks, I saw Marta warm a hardened piece of bread over the hearth and say, "If we can laugh through this smell, we can laugh at anything." And indeed, we laughed. Huddled around the fire, nostrils already accustomed to the aroma that never quite left us, we found in that strange routine a reason to feel less miserable. Perhaps at bottom, that was exactly what kept us alive. In time, even the staunchest critics came to respect the practice. Old Father Angelo, who had once wrinkled his nose and muttered sermons about sins of foul odor, showed up one frosty morning holding his shoes, asking Marta to help him with his cracked feet. She said nothing, simply pointed to the barrel and smiled. After that night, not a single word of reproach was heard from the pulpit, only prayers whispered with far less painful feet. And so, the barrels became a shared secret, something that united us in silence. There was no shame, only an odd camaraderie. Each plunge of fabric, each suppressed giggle at the stench, felt like a pact. Yes, we were poor, but we were resourceful, stubborn, and in our own way, even happy. And among all the odors in the world, that one became for us the unmistakable perfume of survival. There were nights when the entire village seemed to drift to sleep under that peculiar scent. Closed windows could not keep the barrel's odor from seeping through the cracks, mingling with the scent of burning wood and the simple stew bubbling in the cauldrons. And strangely, no one complained. Perhaps because in some way that smell reminded us that we were together, that however harsh life might be, there would always be a barrel, a laugh, and a story to share. One such night, sitting by the hearth, I heard Marta say something I never forgot. "It's not the smell that defines us, but what we do while living with it." Her words lodged in my mind like an old winter song. From then on, whenever I think of that village, I don't recall only the misery or the cold, but the human warmth that bloomed even in the most unlikely places, even from a simple barrel of fermented urine. As the years passed, I began to notice that even visitors left the village changed. They arrived disgusted, mocking our methods, yet departed with newfound respect for that strange practice. Many returned to their towns, sharing tales not only of the smell, but of the strength and ingenuity of a people who, with almost nothing, managed to turn the unpleasant into routine, and routine into something almost familiar. Once, a merchant, already setting off, said to me, "I never thought I'd feel nostalgia for this place, or for that smell." We laughed together, and he departed with a sack of clean wool slung over his shoulder and an expression blending astonishment and affection. In that moment, I realized it wasn't merely poverty that defined us, but the peculiar ability to find comfort even in things the rest of the world would rather forget. There was also a sort of hidden wisdom in this peculiar habit. The children who grew up running among the barrels and laughing at the stench learned early that life would never be made of flowers and perfumes alone. Marta used to say, "Who can endure the smell of a barrel can endure any winter." And indeed, those words proved true. With each passing season, we became more resilient, like cloth washed 1,000 times, yet still strong, still whole. And so, year after year, the custom endured. Even when some of us left for distant lands, we carried the memory of that smell, not as something shameful, but as a strange reminder of who we were. Because in the end, it was not only about washing clothes or cracked feet, it was about surviving with dignity, muffled laughter, and a silent courage that only those who lived it could understand. There came a day, however, when I realized that even the barrels themselves held stories. Marta told me that some of them had been in service for generations, passed down as if they were family heirlooms. "This one," she'd say, tapping gently on the rim of a weathered barrel, "belonged to my grandmother. It survived 3 winters of famine and 2 floods of the river." To her, every mark in the wood was a memory, a scar that testified to how our village had withstood the march of time. And listening to her speak, I understood that those barrels were more than mere containers. They were silent witnesses to our perseverance. No matter the stench, no matter the grimaces of outsiders, what truly mattered was that so long as there was a barrel full and willing hands to work, our village would always find a way forward, even when all seemed lost. One night, as the stars shimmered like distant embers in the sky, I sat beside Marta and asked if she had ever felt ashamed of that custom. She smiled, with the calm of one who has seen many seasons pass, and replied, "My boy, shame is a luxury for those who have a choice." We had none, so we learned to laugh, and in laughter the smell never seemed so bad. Her simple, steadfast words warmed me more than the hearth's fire. And as she spoke, I perceived something even deeper. It was not just barrels or clean clothes. It was a way to transform necessity into something almost human. What to the rest of the world seemed grotesque, for us was just another chapter in a larger story, a story of stubbornness, courage, and a dash of humor that allowed us to endure any winter. In time, I grew to love those quiet nights, when the wind beat against the window panes, and only the barrels stood still outside, like guardians of the village. Sometimes I would close my eyes and almost hear those old laughs, the hurried footsteps of those coming for clean garments, and even Marta's low songs echoing like whispers from the past. There was a strange peace there, a certainty that even amid the acrid smell, we were sheltered by something greater than poverty. And so each winter became a little less cruel, not because the cold lessened, nor because hunger vanished, but because we found a way to laugh at it all. Perhaps that was the true magic of the barrels, not in cleaning our clothes, but in their power to unite weary hearts and transform misery into memory until it ceased to hurt. Over the years I saw many faces depart and others arrive. Some recoiled at the odor, others grew used to it all too quickly, but all without exception carried away a story. Because in the end, no one left that village without having dipped at least once into what it truly was, a place where survival and humor mingled like salt and sea. I recall well when one traveler, ready to depart, declared he would never forget that smell of courage. We laughed, of course, but in silence we all knew he was right. For that odor, so harsh and strange, was in a way the perfume of our history, a reminder that amid laughter, cold and foul barrels, we learned to make even the grotesque feel like home. On one of those nights of thick snow, Marta told me something I keep with me to this day. As she fed the fire with small kindlings, she said, "One day, when I'm gone, they'll laugh at this custom, but that's all right, because they'll remember us too." Her words carried the serenity of one who accepts the passage of time without regret, as one who knows that even the oddest of habits can become a legacy. And I believed her. For when I looked at those barrels, I saw not merely an unpleasant smell or a primitive method, but generations who refused to give up. I saw calloused hands, laughter muffled by the cold, and a strength that no history book could contain. And that night I realized that, even if the world forgot us, that peculiar perfume would still linger in the memories of those who once learned to survive with it. In time, winter gave way to timid springs, and the barrels, once circled by snow, rested under the weak sun that warmed the village's stones. Flowers began to bloom in the cracks of walls, and oddly enough, the smell seemed less harsh in those days. Perhaps it was simply because, with warmth and open windows, there were more laughs in the streets, more voices mingling in the air. And somehow, that made everything lighter, even that which once seemed unbearable. One day, as I watched the children racing through the square and saw Marta, ever faithful, washing clothes in the barrel, I noticed something curious. No one noticed the odor anymore. Not because it had vanished, but because it had become part of who we were, like the distant toll of the church bells or the simple taste of day-old bread. It wasn't pleasant or beautiful, but it was ours, and that was enough. So on one of those serene afternoons, as the sun sank behind the hills, painting the village in copper and honey hues, Marta looked at me and said, "You know, boy, one day you'll miss even that smell." I laughed, finding it impossible. But now, looking back, I understand perfectly. It wasn't the odor itself, but everything it carried. The laughter, the silent resilience, the conversations by the fire, and that strange peace born of hardship. It was then I realized that memory has its own scent, and ours, however unusual, was made of survival and bonds that even misery could not break. And as Marta wrung out another piece of linen with her slow, precise movements, I felt something unexpected: gratitude. Because, in some way, even the grotesque can be beautiful when remembered with affection. Today, when I close my eyes, I don't just see the barrels, but the entire world that revolved around them. I see Marta smiling through tired eyes, hear the children's laughter as they mocked the smell, and feel the gentle warmth of nights when, despite the cold outside, we were united like family. Every detail returns to me like an ancient embroidery, stitched with threads of memory and simplicity. And that is why, in recalling those days, I feel not revulsion, but a strange comfort. For us, those barrels were not merely vessels for an odd custom. They were silent monuments to what it meant to live and endure. And amid cold and poverty, they taught us that even the harshest scents can turn into gentle memories, capable of soothing the heart like a winter lullaby. So whenever I think of that village, it feels as if a piece of it still lives within me. No matter how much time has passed or how far I roam, the simple thought of an old barrel, of Marta's infinite patience in her smile, and of all of us laughing at what once seemed unbearable, brings it all back for a moment. It is as if the past had its own scent, a rugged perfume, yet full of stories, and perhaps that is what makes these memories so comforting. Because when life seems hard, I remember those long winters and the people who, with nothing but ingenuity, turned even fermented urine into hope. And in that remembrance, I find a strange, silent peace, like an old embrace that never fades. The holy, mouldy bread. I recall a cold morning at the monastery when the mist seemed to cloak the stone walls like a silent shroud. The air was heavy with the scent of candle wax and freshly baked bread, though in those days not every loaf was fit for the table. It was in this setting that Brother Osvaldo, serene of gaze and absent-minded in step, made a discovery that would, unwittingly, mark the entire village. He was rummaging through the old pantry, behind jars of honey and sacks of flour, when his fingers brushed against something forgotten. A stale loaf covered in a layer of green mold, so vivid it seemed to glow in the timid light filtering through the narrow window. Brother Osvaldo held the bread with an expression of wonder and curiosity. Instead of discarding it, as any sensible person would, he brought it close to his nose and murmured contemplatively, "Perhaps it is not accident but a sign." His fellow monks regarded him with bemusement, but no one dared contradict the man known for his unwavering faith and for spotting miracles where others saw only mess. Thus, with as much solemnity as he could muster, Brother Osvaldo declared, "Brothers, this is the healing bread, a gift sent from heaven to ease the suffering." At first, everyone chuckled softly, assuming it was merely another of his eccentricities. But in the nearby village, where wounds and fevers were all too common, any promise of relief was welcomed with hope. Within days, rumors of the holy bread spread through the monastery walls like wind through wooden slats. Soon, the first villagers, hats in hand and eyes full of faith, began to arrive, asking for but a crumb to rub on their wounds or dissolve in warm water as if it were a divine balm. Brother Osvaldo, with the patience of one who truly believed, distributed the bread with almost ceremonial care. Each crumb was handed over with a whispered prayer, and the villagers left feeling they had received something more precious than gold. Some who returned days later swore their sores had dried or their pains lessened. Perhaps it was simply time and hope working together, but for many it was irrefutable proof that God indeed breathed miracles even through a loaf forgotten on a shelf. As the weeks passed, the tale of the holy bread grew like the vines climbing the monastery walls. Travelers from distant hamlets arrived weary of foot and eager in eye, bringing simple offerings, eggs, baskets of vegetables, or a jug of cheap wine, seeking only a piece of what had become a cherished relic. Brother Osvaldo, ever humble, accepted nothing but gratitude and a silent prayer, though some monks began to question whether the miracle was not becoming too grand. One especially frigid morning, I remember seeing a line of villagers stretching down the dirt road, waiting patiently at the monastery gates. A respectful hush filled the air, broken only by footsteps on frost-hardened ground and the murmur of prayer. Inside the pantry, Brother Osvaldo watched the loaf shrink with concern, fearing the miracle might finally run out. Then, with a conspiratorial sigh, he said, "If God made it appear once, he will surely make it again." And with that, he placed another loaf in that same forgotten corner, as though planting a seed. To everyone's surprise, and perhaps as proof that faith follows its own path, weeks later, the new loaf too sprouted that same emerald mold. There was no convincing explanation, just a blend of coincidence and oversight. But Brother Osvaldo smiled as one who has seen a prayer answered. Upon hearing the news, the villagers rejoiced, and soon the holy bread ceased to be merely a curiosity and became a tradition. Part improvised remedy, part small domestic miracle, pungent in scent and uncertain in effect, yet brimming with hope. In time, a few monks began to doubt the fervor it inspired. Brother Martin, ever the skeptic, insisted it was nothing more than mold and good fortune. Still, even he could not deny the look of relief on the faces of villagers who returned to give thanks. Perhaps it was faith that healed more effectively than any visible substance. Brother Osvaldo, however, never argued. He simply gave a gentle smile and repeated, "If it's folly, let it be a folly that brings peace." One night, I remember finding the monk alone in the kitchen, the mouldy loaf before him, lit by the flicker of a single candle. He traced his aged fingers over the green crust, not in disgust, but with a tenderness as if handling an ancient sacred text. And while outside the wind moaned through the shutters, Brother Osvaldo whispered a soft prayer, not that the bread might heal wounds, but that it would continue to give hope to those who had nothing else. The next morning, as the monastery gates swung open, a humble woman arrived carrying her child in her arms. The boy bore a nasty cut upon his leg, and worry weighed heavily in his eyes. Brother Osvaldo, calm as ever, broke off a small sliver of the bread and offered it with serene kindness. "It is not the bread that heals," he said gently, "but the faith that accompanies it." The woman nodded, tears glistening, as though those words were more precious than any rare ointment. Ask ChatGPT. Days later, the same woman returned. The boy walked with steady steps, and though the wound still bore signs of its natural healing, she knelt before Brother Osvaldo, thanking him as though she had witnessed a miracle. No one argued. Deep down, perhaps we all understood that it was neither the mold nor science at work, but the strange magic of simple things when blended with hope and a touch of innocent faith. With each new tale of recovery, the reputation of the holy bread spread beyond the hills and fields. Pilgrims arrived from distant hamlets, bearing stories of unlikely cures and whispering humble petitions. The monastery, once silent and forgotten, became a gathering place for the afflicted, where faith carried the peculiar scent of old bread and the gentle promise of comfort. Brother Osvaldo never turned anyone away, even as the crumbs dwindled and he had to break ever smaller pieces. Some monks began recording everything on parchment, fearing that one day someone would need to understand how that simple loaf had become legend. And I, a young novice at the time, helped mill the grain and keep watch over the loaves left by chance on the miracle shelf. Each day seemed the same, and yet carried a discreet enchantment, as if upon opening the pantry door, we never knew whether we would find only bread or another sign of hope, wrapped in green mold. As months passed, even the staunchest skeptics yielded to that strange, almost comforting habit, not because they truly believed in the mold's power, but because they saw something rare in the villagers' eyes: peace. And sometimes, peace was all one needed to endure the long winter nights and the aches that no healer could soothe. Brother Osvaldo, with his absent-minded kindness, became more than a monk. He became the silent guardian of small hopes. I recall one afternoon when snow fell slowly and the monastery lay hushed. Brother Osvaldo approached the window and with serene eyes said, "Perhaps one day someone will uncover that this bread holds more than faith. But until then, let it heal in whatever way it can, even if only the heart." His words etched themselves into me like a simple prayer, one that needs no explanation, only acceptance. And so, in time, the holy bread ceased to be mere curiosity and became an almost sacred tradition. Even when new monks arrived and wrinkled their noses at the notion, all it took was the sight of a villager kneeling with trembling hands around a single crumb to transform laughter into respectful silence. It was impossible not to acknowledge the power of something that, though illogical, warmed so many souls. Today, when I recall those days, I know it was neither the mold nor the prayers that wrought miracles, but the way people, for a brief moment, believed they were touching something greater than themselves. And that is why, whenever the winter wind blows and the smell of freshly baked bread drifts through my memories, I think of Brother Osvaldo and his humble piece of hope, a simple miracle of faith and comfort that did not heal bodies, but soothed hearts. The battle against the fleas. I recall a village so small and so poor that even the church bells seemed weary as they tolled. Its houses, made of clay and thatch, creaked beneath the cold wind rolling down from the hills, and at dusk, the scent of smoke and day-old bread mingled with the bitter perfume of damp earth. It was there, among scrawny chickens and a well that never seemed full, that a plague visited us, not of hunger or pestilence, but something far smaller, and, in its own way, far more persistent: fleas. In those days it felt impossible to escape them. They infested our clothes, our beds, even the folds of our threadbare stockings. At night, while the wind whistled through the gaps in the walls, it was not uncommon to hear someone scratching so furiously that even the rats grew still to listen. But as with every enduring misfortune, someone decided that if we couldn't defeat the fleas, at least we could laugh at them. That someone was Martim, a broad-shouldered peasant with a crooked grin, always as if mocking life itself. Martim owned no riches, but possessed a rare gift, the ability to turn any torment into a celebration. And on one frosty morning, scratching his neck with a straw, he had an idea so absurd that nobody dared contradict him. With the solemnity of a priest on procession day, Martim announced his invention, the flea-hunting contests. At first, everyone laughed, assuming it was just another of his usual antics. But that very afternoon, he gathered men, women, and children around the old fire pit in the square. Clutching a burlap sack and a wooden board for scorekeeping, he declared that the village's honor was at stake, and that the victor would receive nothing less than a chunk of stale bread, almost fresh, as he put it. The rules were simple. Each participant had a set time to hunt fleas from their own clothing and hair. Whoever brought in the greatest number, alive or nearly so, would be crowned champion. The prize was modest, but the enthusiasm was staggering. Before long, the miserable silence of cold nights was replaced by peals of laughter, applause, and even heated debates over whether certain captures were legitimate. At first, many joined merely out of curiosity, arms folded and faces skeptical. But after that first contest, even the sternest among us were won over. I remember Widow Brigida, the grumpiest woman in the village, leaping for joy when she found 3 fleas at once, as though she'd unearthed nuggets of gold. The children, once prone to tears of hunger or cold, laughed themselves breathless, transforming that tiny plague into an occasion for jubilation. Over time, the event took on a solemn air. Martim began crafting straw crowns for the champions, while the losers were penalized by having to stoke the square's fire. No one complained. On the contrary, those flea hunts became the one time we forgot the weight of our lives. Between scratching, laughter, and bits of hard bread shared in small pieces, something almost sacred was born, a stubborn joy as humble as it was genuine. On one occasion, the contest grew so intense that even old Father Lorenzo, who always preached on Christian dignity, could not resist and joined the fray. With his cassock hiked to his knees, he hunted fleas with the same devotion he showed when clasping his rosary. The entire square erupted in laughter, and even he, between gasps, admitted he had never felt such communion among the faithful. Legends arose, too, like the tale of Joachim the miller, who swore one night he had caught a flea as big as a plum pit. Nobody believed him, yet all retold the story for weeks, as if that small collective lie were a blessing against monotony. In that village, every bite ceased to be mere irritation and became fodder for wagers, jokes, or memories to warm the coldest nights. As weeks passed, the flea contests became almost ritual. Martim strung lanterns around the square, their flickering light illuminating faces red with laughter. Some arrived early just to secure a spot by the fire, as though watching a grand spectacle. The poverty remained, but for those few hours it seemed to shrink before that strange, collective joy. And it was against that backdrop that I noticed something curious. The more we laughed, the less it mattered who won. The prize of stale bread no longer held much value. What counted was the sense of belonging, of being together, scratching and laughing as one big family. The fleas, once nothing more than pests, had become almost accomplices, little villains tamed by our laughter. One night, the rain fell so hard it turned the square into a quagmire. I thought no one would come, but one by one they arrived, with drenched clothes and mud-caked feet. Martin, unfazed, simply smiled and said, "If the fleas survived, so can we." And amid thunder and laughter, we hunted those wretched little creatures as if we were defying the very sky. That was the moment I understood. It wasn't about the fleas. It never had been. It was about finding, in the midst of filth, cold and poverty, a reason to laugh. Every itch became an excuse to tell stories, every bite a reminder that even in the bleakest days, we could still gather and invent something that made us feel alive. In time, travelers from neighboring villages began to appear, drawn by rumors of this strange tradition. Some came merely to watch, others to join in. And so the little square, once silent, began to echo with laughter from every corner. Even the merchants passing by on the road declared they had never seen such stubborn joy bloom in a place so forgotten. Martin, with his crooked grin and eyes shining with pride, always insisted he had invented nothing, only reminded everyone that when you have nothing, even a flea can be cause for celebration. And in some way we all believed him. For it was true, among stale bread, bonfires and repeated stories, we found unexpected comfort. Not the absence of misery, but proof that it could not defeat us. Years passed and the flea-hunting contests became more than mere diversion. They became a shared memory, a recollection that warmed hearts even when winters grew too harsh. Many of us aged, and some have gone on. But even now I can close my eyes and hear those laughs echoing through the square, as if time itself dared not erase that sound. And so, whenever the nights grow long and the wind howls as it did in that little village, I remember Martin, his straw crowns, and how even fleas were transformed into hope. Because in the end, perhaps that is what keeps us standing, the ability to laugh when there is no reason, and to find in the smallest and most absurd things the greatness of carrying on. The Doctor and the Leeches. I recall a particularly long winter when the frost seemed never to lift and the chimneys of every cottage poured out more smoke than laughter. People walked with shoulders hunched, not only from the cold, but from ailments that no homemade remedy could cure. It was in those days that a figure appeared on the horizon, a man in a threadbare cloak, a wide-brimmed hat, and a leather satchel that swayed with a damp, unsettling sound. They called him a doctor, though few dared ask where he had learned his art. He came from afar, some whispered, perhaps from lands where words moved more slowly and the winds carried different scents. But everyone knew two things. His steady gaze inspired a strange trust, and his satchel was always full of small, slimy creatures. Leeches that, according to him, could draw out disease as if plucking invisible thorns. Believe it or not, many swore it worked. I still remember the first day I saw him at work. It was in the home of widow Matilda, who could barely leave her bed. The room was filled with a curious hush, broken only by the crackle of the hearth fire and the neighbors' whispered breaths at the doorway. The itinerant doctor opened his satchel with the solemnity of a priest before an altar, then, with almost sacred calm, withdrew a small glass vial. Inside, dozens of leeches writhed as though eager for duty. With steady hands he affixed one to the poor woman's arm. A collective shiver ran through the onlookers, but no one dared speak. With each drop of blood it drew, he murmured words that sounded part prayer, part counsel. "Soon your pain will flow out of you like water from a cracked barrel," he said in such a calm tone that even the greatest skeptics seemed to believe him, if only for a moment. When he finished, Matilda smiled, pale but relieved, swearing she felt lighter. And somehow we all believed it too. After that, no one wanted to miss the leech doctor's treatment. Even the healthy began inventing little ailments, a nagging shoulder ache, a flutter in the chest, even a broken heart, just for a taste of that strange promise of healing. He never turned anyone away. The body and the soul bleed the same way, he'd say, arranging his creatures on a clean cloth and selecting them as though they were precious jewels. I remember one cold night when the tavern was crowded and the doctor offered a public demonstration. A young man, recently spurned by his love, sat before him with hollow eyes, pleading to have this pain removed from my chest. With a gentle smile, the doctor placed 2 leeches over the heart of the lovesick youth. As curious onlookers leaned in, the young man, dizzy and half laughing, proclaimed that he felt nothing at all. Some claimed it was merely blood loss. Others believed it a miracle. To this day, I cannot say which. In the days that followed, the doctor became almost legendary among us. Children trailed him along the dusty lanes, peering into his satchel to glimpse the creatures that seemed more magical than fearsome. The elders greeted him with respect, as though he carried the wisdom of generations on his shoulders, and even those who distrusted his methods never dared challenge him openly. One afternoon, as the sun slipped behind the hills and the village glowed in its last light, the doctor was summoned to the bedside of a man too weak to rise. I was there, holding candles to light the room. I watched as the doctor, in his usual serenity, withdrew 3 of his largest leeches. He placed them on the patient's wrists and at the nape of his neck, murmuring, "May they carry away what weighs you down." And while we all watched in silence, something almost indescribable happened. The man fell asleep, wearing a peaceful smile, as if he had finally found rest. The next morning, the ailing man not only opened his eyes, but asked for a piece of bread with an almost childlike appetite. It was as though life had begun to flow through his veins once more, along with renewed hope. Suddenly, no one questioned the itinerant doctor's methods. Even the most rational among us, who had once frowned at the leeches, now addressed him as doctor, with near reverent tones. Thus the village came to await his visits as eagerly as a market fair or a festival. Each cure, each moment of relief, even if born only of faith, became the subject of long conversations by the hearth. It mattered not whether it was science, miracle, or mere suggestion. For us, what counted was seeing weary faces light up, even if just for an instant. And in those days, that was more than enough to keep hope alive. There was, however, something curious about it all. The doctor never took coins willingly. Instead, he asked for bread, a little wine, or even stories. He would say, "The soul must be fed too." And so, between one bleeding session and the next, he would listen to the village's confessions, broken hearts, land disputes, dreams left unrealized. At times, he seemed more a priest than a healer. Perhaps that was why, despite the gruesome air about him, his presence brought us a strange comfort. I recall one night of heavy fog when I sat beside him by the tavern's hearth. The leeches, stored in his satchel, lay motionless as if sleeping too. I asked whether he found it disgusting to handle those creatures day after day. He smiled, weariness in his eyes, but serenity in his voice, and replied, "No, my boy. They only do what we ourselves lack the courage to do, remove some of the weight we carry inside." I never forgot those words, perhaps because back then we all needed to believe there was a way to feel a little lighter. Over time, I began to notice that not everyone who sought the doctor was truly ill. Some came only for relief, as though each leech bite were also a way to empty their worries. I saw rough peasants, accustomed to labor from dawn to dusk, leave his cottage with moist eyes, murmuring a nearly embarrassed "thank you." And he, with infinite patience, never judged. He simply nodded, as though he understood better than anyone the invisible burden we all bore. Once, a young woman named Eleanor, known in the village for her easy laughter, came to him not with fever, but with a broken heart. He said nothing. He simply asked her to sit, placed a single leech on her hand, and waited. When he finished, Eleanor sighed deeply and smiled, as though that simple gesture had carried away a pain no medicine could reach. In that moment, I realized that for many, what the doctor offered was not merely cure, but consolation. The seasons changed, and the doctor continued coming and going like the wind across the fields. Whenever his silhouette appeared on the road, satchel swinging and hat pulled low, a murmur of relief ran through the village. It mattered not if it was winter, with its long, biting nights, or summer when heat clung to the skin. His arrival was always a silent balm. There was one day, however, that remains etched in my memory. A small boy, feverish and breathing weakly, was delivered into the doctor's care. We all gathered around his bed almost without hope, yet the doctor remained calm. He chose the tiniest leeches, applied them gently, and waited. When after long hours the child finally opened his eyes and asked for water, a collective sigh swept the room. Some said it was mere luck, but looking at that man, I could not doubt there was something extraordinary in his unwavering faith. After that day, the doctor became more than a visitor. He became part of the very life of the village. When he was away for weeks, he left behind a nearly tangible longing. Like the absence of an old song everyone hoped to hear again. And when he returned, there was no bell or announcement, only that reverent hush as the doors opened and the sick, one by one, went to meet him. One night, under a pale moonlight in the square, I sat beside him on the tavern's threshold. I asked if he had ever thought of stopping, putting down his satchel of creatures and resting like any other man. He only smiled, gazing at the starry sky, and said, "As long as there is someone who needs to feel lighter, my feet will always have a path to follow." In that moment, I understood that it was not just the leeches that healed us, but the hope he carried with him. Over the years, many things changed. Children grew up, some elders passed on, and new families arrived in the village. But the doctor, he seemed the same. Perhaps a little more bent, with deeper wrinkles around his eyes, but still with that serene gaze and his inseparable satchel. And each time the wind carried word of his approach, it was as if a piece of the past returned with him. Once, I saw him tend to a man who claimed to be possessed by a sorrow so great he could barely rise from his bed. The doctor asked no questions. He simply placed 2 leeches on the man's wrists and waited in silence, as though giving him the time necessary to empty his own pain. When he finished, the patient said nothing. He only drew a deep breath and for the first time in weeks managed to sleep. I never forgot that scene, for it taught me that sometimes what heals most is not the remedy, but the peace that comes with it. Over time, the stories of the doctor and his leeches spread beyond the fields and woods surrounding our village. Travelers passing along the road heard of him and, whether from curiosity or desperation, came seeking his aid. Some brought ailments we had never heard of. Others carried only deep sorrows that no salve could soothe. Yet he welcomed them all, with the same serene smile and the patience he showed our oldest neighbors. I recall one bitterly cold night when the tavern filled with so many strangers that it was hard to move between the tables. The doctor, seated near the hearth, treated them one by one with the unhurried calm of a man untouched by haste. And we villagers remained silent, almost proud, as though that ragged-cloaked figure and his wide-brimmed hat were our most precious secret. It was strange, but somehow, even with his gruesome tools, his presence made the world feel more bearable. In time, I noticed that no one truly cared whether his methods were sound or simply superstition. It didn't matter. What counted was the tranquility he brought, like a gentle breeze amid life's storms. There was something in the way he applied those leeches, as if each motion were a quiet blessing, and suddenly even the fear of those little creatures seemed to vanish. One pre-dawn hour, I awoke to the soft echo of footsteps outside. Peering through the window, I saw the doctor walking beneath the pale moonlight, his satchel swinging like a leather bell marking the night's rhythm. For a moment, I thought to call him, but instead stood there, watching. And without a word, I felt an inexplicable peace. Just the sight of that calm, solitary silhouette reminded me that somehow we were all in good hands. Over the years, I came to understand that we would likely never know who he truly was, where he came from, or where he vanished when he was away for weeks. Some said he had been a medical student who abandoned his studies. Others whispered he was merely a common man who had learned more from suffering than from books. But to us, none of that mattered. He was simply the leech doctor, and that was enough. There was a final time I saw him. It was spring, and the fields were carpeted with white blossoms. He paused before me, wearing that same tranquil smile, and told me he would be leaving again, perhaps for a long while. He did not ask whether we would miss him. He knew the answer. He merely laid his hand on my shoulder and whispered, "Remember, it isn't the leeches that heal, but the hope that tomorrow will be lighter." Then he was gone, leaving behind only the soft sound of his footsteps and the memory of a man who, with strange methods and unwavering faith, taught us that even healing can possess a touch of poetry. Since then, whenever the wind howls through the hills, I like to imagine him still roaming from village to village with his satchel and steady gait. Perhaps somewhere far off, someone is even now offering their pale arm to a tiny leech, believing, just as we did, that a bit of relief can be found in the most unlikely things. And on the quietest of nights, when I sit before the hearth and watch the embers fade, I almost hear his calm, sure voice, as though he never truly left. In those moments, I remember how, even in hard times, we all need something or someone to help us feel lighter. And somehow, the doctor and his leeches live on in those memories, like a story that never ends, but gently rests within us, warming the heart like an old lullaby. So each winter, when the cold deepens and the village seems to shrink beneath the weight of snow, I tell this tale to the young ones gathered around the fire. They listen with bright eyes and curious smiles, sometimes laughing at the thought of leeches, sometimes wondering if it all really happened. I only smile and say that back then, it didn't matter if it was true or not. What mattered was the hope he left behind. And as the flames crackle and night deepens, I close my eyes and can almost see him once more, walking along the frosty road, his lone figure etched against the moon. And I think that somewhere, perhaps he still offers relief to those in need, not only with his leeches, but with that quiet calm that seemed capable of lifting much of the world's burden. And with that gentle memory, I drift to sleep, certain that some stories never truly go away. They simply rest with us, like old lullabies. And so, night after night, his memory blends with the sound of the wind slipping through the windows and the scent of wood smoke swirling from the stove. There is no one who does not feel a certain comfort in knowing that, even in such harsh times, someone was able to turn fear into faith and discomfort into hope. The leech doctor was neither a saint nor a sage, but somehow he was exactly what we needed. And perhaps that is why, to this day, whenever life feels heavier than it should, I think of him and his gentle words. Soon it will feel lighter. And suddenly, that simple remembrance makes the world seem less cold, as if that old satchel and its little strange remedies still walked with us among the sleeping houses, bringing relief where once there was only silence. And so, cradled by this soft memory, I surrender to sleep, as though following in the slow footsteps of the man who never stopped believing. The hat against the plague. I remember clearly the day I first saw Martin crossing the square with an iron pot firmly jammed on his head, like a poorly fitted crown. The autumn sun gilded the village rooftops, and the air carried that bittersweet scent of smoke and burning herbs which the priests swore kept the plague at bay. Eccentricities were not uncommon in times of fear, but nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared my eyes for that sight. Martin walked with solemn dignity, the pot clanking at each step, while suppressed laughter mingled with the owl's melancholy hoots in the distance. In the days leading up to that scene, the plague had already begun its whispering spread, something no one wanted to hear but everyone felt. Houses were marked with straw symbols, and the wind seemed to carry a heavy silence, broken only by families' cries and the little church bell. It was in that setting that Martin, convinced by a strangely simple idea, decided metal could block the poisoned airs. And looking at the face hidden beneath the rusty rim of that pot, I confess that for a moment I almost believed him. It wasn't long before madness found company. On the second day, I saw Gerda, the baker's wife, trudging through the market with an old copper cauldron strapped to her head by a linen cord. She carried herself with curious dignity, as though she held the secret to saving her entire family. Close behind her came her youngest son, wearing nothing more than a small wooden bucket, which banged against his ears with every step, but still he wore the serious look of someone taking part in something grand. The laughter ringing through the square was not mockery, it was relief. In such fearful times, even a pot could feel like a blessing. As the days passed, the spectacle only grew. The market, once dark and silent, filled with clanking metal figures weaving among vegetable stalls and cloth merchants. The clang of iron and copper blended with whispered prayers, and even the church bells seemed less mournful at the sight of this improvised procession. Some villagers polished their lids until they shone like mirrors. Others, lacking resources, tied whatever they could find, old cooking shields, barrel tops, around their heads. None knew if it would work, but for some reason, seeing so many covered heads restored a bit of courage to all our hearts. One afternoon, as the sky turned a leaden grey, I saw Father Anselmo watching the pot parade with a mix of astonishment and resignation. He said nothing, only crossed himself and retreated into the church, carrying a flask of wine, perhaps to better cope with his flock's absurd march. Some said even he, in secret, had tried slipping a small pan over his head, just in case. I cannot swear it's true, but that week I noticed a strange gleam atop his cassock, yet the villagers' creativity did not stop there. Some lined the inside of their pots with sprigs of rosemary and sage leaves, swearing it would further purify the air. Others hung tiny bells from the handles, believing the tinkling would scare away the plague like an invisible scarecrow. The market, once hushed and fearful, became a macabre festival, full of metallic chimes and the pungent aroma of burning herbs. And oddly enough, amid all that dread, we began to laugh again, not in mockery but with a weary, hopeful laughter, like those finding shelter in absurdity. A few even turned the practice into competition. On cold nights around the tavern hearth, we debated which pot was most effective against poisoned air. Martin, with his heavy iron pot, swore nothing could penetrate it. Gerda vied for the copper's shine, claiming even rats avoided it. And amid laughter and sips of watered-down ale, we wagered stale bread and chunks of hard cheese, as if that contest could somehow keep the plague at bay. Perhaps it didn't, but it gave us something to look forward to when fear knocked at our doors. And deep down, I believe that was what mattered most. While the world outside seemed to crumble, we, with our heads covered in pots, built a small bulwark against despair. Not of stone or steel, but one made of hope, disguised as folly. Gazing at that strange metallic crowd crossing the square beneath the pale moonlight, I realized we were doing more than simply trying to guard against the plague. We were all reminding ourselves how to live and to laugh, even if only for a moment. One morning, a thick fog blanketed the village, making everything quieter than usual. From the hilltop, I watched dozens of figures walking slowly, their heads gleaming in the dim light like knights of an improbable army. The sound of bells tied to their pots rang out almost melodically, mingling with the whisper of the wind. For an instant, it seemed the entire village had found a peculiar order within chaos, as though those kettles and cauldrons were crowns of a kingdom invented just to keep us standing. And so, amid dented pots and rusty cauldrons, we survived. When someone fell ill and miraculously recovered, they said it was thanks to the iron helmet. When someone passed away, we whispered that at least they had fought bravely. Little by little, without even realizing it, that custom ceased to be merely fear. It became part of our story. A story that, even today when I recall it, brings a smile to my face, because in the midst of plague, hunger and uncertainty, we learned that even a pot on the head can be a shield against sorrow. As time passed, the plague began to recede, like a shadow losing strength before the light. One by one the bells fell silent, and the pots returned to the hearths, now bearing dents and scratches that told tales of courage and folly. Martin, however, kept his on for several more weeks, swearing he would remove it only once he was certain the air was truly clean. We laughed at him, but we all understood. After so much fear, it was hard to let go of the one talisman that seemed to work. Today, when I close my eyes and think back on those days, I don't remember only the fear, but the metallic clatter of pots in the wind, the muffled laughter under the weight of absurdity, and the strange unity it brought us. That is how we discovered that, even in the darkest times, hope sometimes takes the most unexpected forms. And if ever someone tells you this story, do not laugh in scorn. Just smile, knowing that deep down, it wasn't really about pots, but about finding a way not to give up. The cheese with maggots. Even today, when sleep slips away and the night spreads its starry cloak over the silent fields, I recall that old market in the village's central square. It was a distant time of frosty mornings and golden afternoons, where the scent of rare spices mingled with the earthy aroma of soil and livestock. Amid the familiar sounds of heated haggling and merry laughter, one vigorous cry always stood out: the cheese merchant's, proudly proclaiming his singular product with the pride of any master craftsman. This merchant, a burly man with rosy cheeks and a thick beard dusted white like freshly milled flour, displayed his most coveted cheese on a shelf front and center. It was no ordinary cheese. It teemed with tiny, writhing maggots, and the livelier they squirmed, the more he assured his customers the fresher and more flavorful the cheese. "Look how they move, good people. You won't find greater freshness," he exclaimed with a wide, welcoming grin, while curious children edged closer to witness the spectacle, giggling and making exaggerated faces. At first, I admit I watched with mingled repulsion and fascination, uncertain what to make of such culinary daring. On one side of the stall stood the seasoned villagers, patiently awaiting their turn with coins carefully counted in their calloused hands. On the other side lingered the more cautious or perhaps less brave folk who whispered amused disbelief from a safe distance. I hovered between those two groups, caught in a curious limbo of hesitation. I remember clearly an old blacksmith, his strong arms and stern expression belying his peculiar taste for odd delicacies. He strode forward decisively, pointing to the largest wedge available. "Give me that one, good man. Those little worms look livelier than ever," he declared, laughing loudly enough that everyone in the square could hear. The crowd responded with a chorus of laughter, exclamations and shocked murmurs as the merchant wrapped the cheese, clearly delighted to be handing over a rare treasure to his enthusiastic buyer. As the morning wore on, I watched the bravest customers depart the stall, carrying their small parcels with pride and a mischievous glint in their eyes. My curiosity grew, fueled by the contrasting reactions of those sampling the strange delicacy. Some chewed slowly, eyes closed in deep satisfaction, murmuring praises. Others wore puzzled expressions, as if trying to decipher a profound mystery revealed only by taste. Noticing my hesitation, the merchant, adept at spotting uncertain customers, beckoned me with an inviting smile. "Come, young one, fear not the unknown. This cheese awakens the soul and lifts the spirit," he said in a friendly, almost philosophical tone. It was hard to resist that warm invitation and the conspiratorial glances of the women who watched me with playful interest. I took a deep breath, stepped forward, and felt I had crossed an invisible line between caution and gastronomic courage. With bated breath and heart beating slightly faster, I accepted the generous slice offered by the merchant, holding it with equal parts care and apprehension. The tiny pale maggots writhed enthusiastically, producing an indescribable sensation, somewhere between discomfort and amused surprise. I closed my eyes for an instant, raised the morsel to my lips, and tasted that unexpected flavor, every sense on high alert. Immediately, I realized my initial reaction had been excessive. There was indeed something unique and extraordinary about that cheese. Its taste was bold, slightly tangy and salty, with a creamy texture that contrasted delightfully with the subtle movement of the little creatures. Strange as it wasn't unpleasant. Instead, it intrigued me, awakening my senses in an entirely new way. An involuntary smile curved my lips, and the old merchant nodded in satisfaction, as if he had known all along exactly how I would react. Encouraged by my acceptance, more wary villagers began to approach the stall, emboldened by my unexpected display of pleasure. Soon, the crowd surged even larger, timid smiles and curious glances lighting up faces hitherto filled with doubt. The merchant, sensing the growing demand, amped up his showmanship as he distributed fresh slices with genuine delight. What had once seemed grotesque now felt like a spontaneous celebration in the heart of that medieval square. Among the recent purchasers was the gentle village washerwoman, whose kind eyes bore an unusual spark that day. After bravely biting into the cheese, she raised her voice theatrically for the entire square to hear. "I never thought I'd say this, but these little maggots are the most delicious creatures I've ever tasted." Everyone burst into joyful laughter, caught up in the light-hearted, communal spirit of that shared moment. And so the sun was already high when I realized that this small episode had changed not only my palate, but the entire atmosphere of the village. The villagers, ordinarily so caught up in daily concerns, seemed more relaxed and united. Strangely, those wriggling maggots had played an unexpected role. They had broken the rhythm of our routine, bringing laughter, courage, and a pleasant sense of collective discovery, however unusual. Later that day, I found myself sitting beneath a tree by the church, still musing over that singular experience. The sweet scent of ripe apples hung in the air, mingling with the soft murmur of distant conversations. As I watched the village's gentle bustle, I noticed the old merchant in the distance, preparing to depart with his cart nearly empty. Catching my gaze, he gave me a friendly wave and a knowing smile, as if he understood that he had shared with me and with the entire village something far more valuable than a mere cheese studded with maggots. That night, as stars slowly dotted the sky, I realized the little village felt more alive and harmonious than ever. Soft sounds drifted from the glowing windows of cottages, blending with the faint crackle of hearth fires and the distant bark of dogs keeping watch over the tranquil night. It was as though something simple, even eccentric, had woven invisible bonds among us, reminding everyone that sometimes it takes courage to uncover the unexpected delights life offers. Lying on my soft straw mattress, wrapped in a blanket my mother had woven with patient hands, I smiled as my eyes gently closed. The memory of that cheese, which had once seemed so strange and frightening, had become a sweet, warm and comforting recollection. After all, I thought to myself, Isn't that precisely what makes life so enchanting? Finding joy and comfort in the smallest surprises even, or especially the oddest and most improbable ones. Many years have passed since then, yet that morning remains vivid in my memory, like a small jewel polished by time. Often, after long days in the fields, I would share this story with my children and grandchildren gathered around the hearth. They listened intently, eyes bright with fascination, their young faces a mixture of amusement and disbelief. To them, it seemed an enchanting legend. To me, it was a precious lesson about openness and courage in the face of the unknown. And today, dear listener, as you rest snug beneath your blankets, perhaps you too will recall a similar memory. Something once strange or frightening that, with time, grew into a sweet and welcoming remembrance. For it is these curious, simple moments that enrich our lives, filling silent nights with stories that warm even the most restless hearts. Now, as my voice gently fades into the stillness of this starry night, allow yourself to be carried by the serene comfort that only ancient tales can provide. Remember, as I learned on that distant morning in the village square, that we do not always need to fully understand what we experience. Sometimes it is enough simply to savor the moment with gentle curiosity and an open heart. May this light, comforting memory cradle you into a peaceful sleep, and may your dreams be dotted with recollections as pleasant and soothing as the scent of fresh mornings, the sound of soft laughter, and the simple joy found in unexpected places. Rest deeply, dear listener, knowing that tonight we have journeyed together once more through the timeless landscapes of shared memory.